Today I'm going to be doing a colored pencil demonstration of orchids and clownfish and blending with powder blender. Hi, I'm Lisa, the artist behind Lachri Fine Art. Yet another week where my artwork is not finished when I record the intro. It'll be finished by the end of the video though. Today I'm working on Fisher400 Sanded Paper. This one is already mounted on conservation board, so it's really nice to work on. I'm using polychromos colored pencil with some luminance and Pablo's for my final details. And I'm blending with powder blender from brushandpencil.com. If you are unfamiliar with what powder blender is, I do have several videos. I'll have a playlist pop up right here so you can check those out. But essentially you want to work on a non-absorbent paper, so either gessoed paper or sanded paper. If you are supporters over on Patreon, I have the 2-hour version of this tutorial available for you now, complete with voiceover, so make sure to head over and check that out. Now we'll move on to this tutorial. I started by drawing out my subject with a 4H graphite pencil. I am now taking a polychromos in gray and filling in my background. And then I'm going to layer a bit of magenta over that and a darker gray around the outside edges before I start blending out with the powder blender. With the powder blender, I am using a Soft Tools blending brush or sponge, whatever we want to call it, to blend that out. Just a little bit of powder blender goes a very long way. Once that is blended, I'm going to use my texture fixative, spray over the entire thing. This is another one from brushandpencil.com. Spray everything, let it dry completely, and that's going to seal this layer down. Once that dries, I can go over it with another layer, and it doesn't really affect the previous layers. So you can notice how very messy I'm being here. I've got pencil strokes going every which direction. It doesn't matter. It all blends out when I go back over it with powder blender. Sprayed it again with my texture fixative, let it dry, and continued layering until I got this as dark as I wanted. In this process, I repeated about 6 or 7 times until I got everything really, really dark. Now, if you're trying to get a dark background like this and you're trying to get this done in many layers, but you're not spraying the texture fixative, then you're pretty much just going to get to a point where you're knocking more of the product, the pencil and the powder blender, it's just kind of being knocked off the paper instead of getting darker. That texture fixative is a very, very important stage in creating something that has this many layers and is this dark. Blending that out. And the great thing with the texture fixative, if you get to a point where you have lost too much of the tooth of your paper because you've been burnishing or however, lots of layers, that texture fixative is going to bring that texture back so you can continuously layer. You won't hit a point where you just can't get more layers as long as you're using that product. And if you have a small area where you've burnished and you've lost the tooth, you can use the touch-up texture that comes in the little bottle. It looks like a nail polish bottle. That's the one that you typically see me mixing in with white for fine details. You can use that to paint over small areas, which I did a little bit later on the clownfish, where I just needed a little bit more tooth to the paper for those. So now I'm taking a light gray pencil and I'm making little circles here and just smudging those out. I will use the Soft Tool blender for the areas that I really want softened out, and areas that I just want a little bit smudged, I'm using my fingers to blend. There's still a little bit of powder blender left on that Soft Tool brush. You don't have to reload it constantly. I'm not kidding when I say a little bit goes a very long ways. Getting some little circles in there. Next, I'm going to spray my texture fixative over all of this and go around my edges with even more color. And that is going to soften it up, but you will still be able to see the circles that I had done because I've sprayed it with the texture fixative. What I'm doing is essentially applying what we would call a glaze in oil or acrylic paint, where I'm tinting the color, but you can still see the details that I drew on my previous layer. As long as you've sprayed that texture fixative, you'll be able to blend over like I'm doing here, without losing all of those circles. You can see I was able to soften up the edges really nicely on those so they weren't too harsh. Adding a few more in there. When I'm filling the colored pencil out for a lot of this, you'll notice that I hold my pencil to the side. I get more surface area that way. If I'm not working with powder blender, that is not how I'm going to work. I'll use the tip of the pencil so that I get the pencil into all of those little nooks and crannies. But when working with powder blender, I can go a lot faster because the powder blender is going to smooth that out. Now this section is from the live stream last week, and I will put a link in the video description and I'll have a card pop up if you want to see this part in real time. So it's going very, very quickly since you can watch the real time version of this here on YouTube. And I'm just layering approximately where my lights and darks go. I don't really worry too much at these stages, these earlier layers, about the color being exact, the detail being exact. I just want to get everything blocked in so I know about where those lights. Now you guys know I'm a huge fan of layers, and that is especially true when working in Powder Blender. You technically could do everything in a single layer. The thing is, you're not going to have the same amount of depth that you will get if you're layering colors, where you're doing what, like I said before, is pretty much what we'd call a glaze in oil or acrylic painting. It will give you a lot more depth in that finished piece if you are doing a lot of layers or a lot of glazers. I'm making up words, glazes, if you want to call it that. So on to the clownfish. Here is a good example of how you know a clownfish is orange, but you don't want to just color it in solid orange. He's going to look very flat. And that's the same thing with pretty much everything. No matter what color something is, depending on how the light is, unless you're painting or drawing a cartoon, you're going to have a lot of highlights, a lot of shading. So on the clownfish, I'm using a lot of white, yellow, I'm mixing those two together, about 3 different shades of orange. I've got some red, I've got magenta, and eventually I'll have purple in there as well. There are a lot of colors in order to make him look three-dimensional. One of the most common problems that I've seen people who are trying Powder Blender for the first time have is that they're not spraying the texture fixative and doing these layers. They're trying to get everything blended out in the one shot, and it just doesn't really work right that way. I mean, it can be done. I think my first few I was working largely that way, but I wasn't getting my color saturation quite where you can get it when you're doing the layering like this. The layer, spray your texture fixative, let it dry, and then glaze or layer over it. You can get your colors so saturated if that's what you want. You just have a lot of control when working this way. And you can change your mind on things. There were times where I realized, you know what? I don't like this flower petal. I'm going to remove it completely. And I was able to do that. If I were working in colored pencil, how I normally do with blending with odorless mineral spirits, that is not something I would have been able to do. It wouldn't have layered right. I wouldn't have been able to get the layers necessary to do that. And here I can. Now, if you look at the flower that is still showing, but I haven't started yet, look at how much gray and black has fallen onto it from when I filled in the background. It doesn't matter. You don't really have to worry about keeping your edges clean or sharp as you're working when you get that fuzzy background. You will have that kind of fallout of the pencil as you blend onto other areas. It will be completely covered by the colored pencil. You won't even notice that it ever was there. So it's not a problem at all. Another big tip I have for you, and this is something that I misunderstood when I first started working with these products. I seemed to be under the impression that if I sprayed the touch-up texture or the texture fixative, that I had to cover any area that I didn't want. So like the flower that I hadn't started yet, that I would have to cover up that flower so that I didn't get extra texture fixative on that. You don't have to. It doesn't matter. I can be an absolute mess with this stuff. Spray everywhere, even in an area that doesn't actually need it yet. It doesn't affect anything. Now you do want to make sure that you shake that can really, really well. It builds up this sort of residue that needs to be mixed in with everything, and I don't know what the technical terms are, but you really need to mix it up well for it to work well. And if you start having a problem where it's splattering really bad, you can pull the nozzle off the can and rinse it or soak it in hot water for a few minutes and then dry it off. It'll clean it really well so that you don't have it spitting. But if you do have that can start spitting globs of the texture fixative out, it doesn't really matter. When you blend over it, you won't notice. It's not hurting or messing anything up. So don't stress out if that happens. As I work on this flower, it's the same thing, just paying attention to my lights and my darks. I'm going to come back through later on and worry about my little details and edges and keeping everything clean. My first several layers, as you watch me work on this, you'll see they're fuzzy. They're just almost slightly out of focus. Not quite what I want my end result to be. That's normal. Every layer, every additional layer from here on out, I will start to tighten up those details, to clean up edges, to get more detail. But those first few layers, that's not really important. I just want to get the color on the paper, get everything covered really well. Now you'll start seeing me use a Pablo from Caran d'Ache. They're white That works so well for your tight, small details when working on sanded paper and when working with powder blender. It's funny because I was never a huge fan of those pencils before because they don't really work with my techniques. They're too waxy for how I normally, or when I blend with odorless mineral spirits. Here with this, oh my gosh, they are wonderful. I had to go and buy a whole bunch more because of that and black. I use them so much for the small detail. They're perfect, but I don't want to use them on areas that are going to need to be blended out with a powder blender. For that, I'm going to stick with my polychromos white, which is actually very opaque when you work on sanded paper like this. But for those little edges, little details, the Pablo black and white are on my must-have list now. And I find when I'm working on regular paper, just because of how I layer, the luminance will get me finer details or more opaque details than I can get with the Pablo. So again, it just doesn't work with my techniques, but here, they are great. And if you use a wax-based pencil and blend, you can use wax-based pencils and blend to an extent with powder blender, but it's not going to get you the same soft results that you'll get with your oil-based pencils like the polychromos. The paper that you're seeing here, this is glassine. I keep that under my hand to prevent my hand from smudging the work and to keep the oils from my skin off the paper. And these first few layers always feel like more like something I would expect from a child. Very basic. There is some shading, but it's not very realistic. My values aren't great. Nothing's great here. That's okay. Don't let that freak you out as you're working. Onto this clownfish, I'm starting with those highlights. I've blocked the yellow in, then started with a light orange and just built up to my darker oranges and finally reds and magentas. And nothing needs to be perfect. One of my favorite things about working with a powder blender and working on sanded paper is that it doesn't need to be perfect. If I mess something up, it doesn't matter. I can go over on my next layer and completely fix any screw up I could possibly make. It is so much more forgiving than when I work with odorless mineral spirits. With those pieces, I really have to have everything very, very well planned out. When I'm working on sanded paper, just because you're able to layer so much, if I randomly decide, hey, I want an extra fish here, I could do that, and you won't be able to tell the difference. I'm not really going to be able to do that when I've been blending with odorless mineral spirits on, let's say, Fabriano Artistico. Now you can use odorless mineral spirits with this, in combination with this. You just want to make sure that if you've used a layer with powder blender, that you sprayed your texture fixative, sealed that down, and then let's say you were doing another layer with finer details and you wanted to use odorless mineral spirits. At that point, you'd be okay to use odorless mineral spirits. But if you've got an area where you've blended with powder blender, don't go straight on top of that with the odorless mineral spirits. You end up with this sort of muddy, chalky mess. But as long as you've sprayed that with your texture fixative, you are fine for future layers to use odorless mineral spirits. Assuming, again, powder blender hadn't been used on that layer yet. So once I've got everything blocked in with that layer, I'm going to come through and start making my color saturation a lot stronger. So I'm using more of this bright orange. It's a very pale orange, but you can see it really stands out there. And I'm also using a lot of purple here for my shading, for my shadows. I'm also using that purple on my clownfish. At this point, I would say I'm about 3 layers in where I've sprayed with the texture fixative on these flowers and on the clownfish. There's that Pablo white. Look how I can go around those edges, and it's so bold. And then I can take a yellow, if I wanted a yellow to really stand out, but it wasn't standing out enough against the black, I can take that yellow and go over the Pablo color, and now the yellow will be very bold, whereas the yellow on its own wasn't quite as strong. But I can get such great edges there. And then for areas that I want even smaller edges, then I'll mix my touch-up texture and titanium white mixture. Now what you're seeing me do here is take the titanium white powder and applying it directly to the paper with my sponge or sponge brush. I haven't decided what those are called yet. Makeup applicator? But I was able to make even softer, just bring out some of those circles by applying that powder, the titanium white powder, directly to that. And that's really the goal or the point of the titanium white powder, is that you can paint with it. You can take a brush, I could apply it with a soft tool, I could apply it with that little sponge applicator, and paint right onto the paper to get lighter areas like I did here with those circles. And I could have done all of those little circles for the background. I could have done that first just with that and not the pencil at all. That also would have been an option. I've got to shade the bottom portions of all of the white stripes on the clownfish with purples and grays. I don't want them to be too white. I am going to want portions to be very, very bright to make them stand out, like the tops that I'm working on here. But I need to make sure that the bottom sections are shaded, otherwise they're going to look very flat. If you compare this clownfish to the other three that I've not worked on this layer yet, look at the difference when you keep adding the shadows, adding the purples and magentas. Don't just think, and then this is something that I see happen a lot. People think if they find just the perfect color, that's what's going to make their work look realistic. I just need that perfect color of orange, that perfect color of yellow. That's not how it works. It's about getting your color saturation, about getting your values right, getting your lights light enough and your darks dark enough. That's what's going to make your work look more realistic. Finding one perfect color is how you draw cartoons, but when you're working in realism, it's a question that I get so often. Well, what colors do I use, or what color do I use for skin? Well, it depends on the person's skin tones. And even more than that, it depends on the lighting that the person is in. I can take a photo of one person and put it in certain lighting, and I'm going to need a very specific set of pencils to create those colors if I really wanted to capture those same colors. I put that same person in a different lighting situation. It can just be across the room. It doesn't even have to be that severe. And I may need a completely different set of colors now. So anytime somebody tries to tell you, these are the colors you always use to create skin, those are a base. You can use those as a base, but there's no one, like you can't really answer that without knowing more information. There's too many factors involved that will change things completely. So don't be so caught up on, I need the exact one right color. That's what'll make my work look realistic. What's going to really make the difference are your values. How light are your lights? How dark are your darks? That will make all the difference in the world. Color matters, but your values matter a lot more. I mean, these are yellow flowers. I'm not just using yellow, clearly. I'm using so many colors. I had so many pencils pulled out of my pencil drawers as I worked on this. Now, a lot of these shadows, I first laid down this lighter purple that you see there. I've got some darker purple for the darkest portions. And then I took that light yellowy orange color and went over all of that. And this helped create a bit of a glow through the shadow that I'm trying to create here. Just a long layering process. And another question that I'm often asked is, how do you know which colors to layer? How did you know to put purple and then orange on top? Practice and experience. You can read every color theory book in the world, but if you don't practice it, if you don't try it and say, hey, what happens if I lay these colors on top of each other? What happens if I do this? What happens if I do that? That what happens question is so important in your progression as an artist and improving your work. You have to be willing to make the mistake and be willing to experiment. That's what's going to improve your work the most. Getting some final details on here. At this point, it was right around here where I got to the point where a lot of these clownfish just were not taking additional colors. I had burnished, I had blended so much, and so even on the sanded paper, I had worked all of the grit of the paper off, or not off, but it was just very, very smooth. So I just took my touch-up texture, the one that comes in the little nail polish like bottle, and painted it directly on the paper on that clownfish, and then I had texture again and was able to put more layers. And like I said earlier, you don't run out of layers that way. You're not going to hit a point where you can't keep doing that. You do want to keep in mind, though, that these products are not flexible. So you want to make sure that you're working on a surface that's going to stay flat. So like with this, I've got it on, it's already on the mounted board, so I don't have to worry about it. But if I were working on a piece of sanded paper that I taped down, I can't roll it up in a tube and ship it like I might normally to save on shipping costs and to better protect the artwork. Sometimes it seems safer than shipping them flat. But with this, I can't do that. I need to make sure that they're shipped flat, that they stay flat. Otherwise, I can have problems with that. So now I just work on mounted board like this, or the mounted sanded paper, and it works really, really nicely. Not something I ever have to worry about. Plus, I'm not fighting with tape constantly lifting as I work. That can always be annoying. This yellow, I'm going over now. Everything's dry, or I've sprayed it, going on to the next layer, and now I really want to hype up the values, the color saturation here. And so I'm taking these yellows and oranges and pretty much just going over what I already have. You can still see my shading underneath. You can still see a lot of the detail. I'm just strengthening that. I'm also adding the tiny little detail, the little specks on the flowers. This is my final layer, so this is where I'm really going to come through and do that. Here's where I've mixed my touch-up texture and titanium white mixture. I will have a card pop up so you can see how I do that. And I'm just painting on the little teeny tiny details that are too fine for even a pencil to get. I went around the edges of the fish's eyes, little tiny details like that, and then once it dried, I was able to go on top of it with a light orange so that that light orange rim really showed. So here's the photo taken in better lighting of the finished piece. And I really, really hyped up that color saturation towards the end. Just going through everything, pulling out more of the oranges and the purples made everything just glow, which was my goal. So I got these orchids recently and I posted a photo of them over on Facebook and somebody said, hey, you should do a drawing with the orchids and clownfish. And I thought, that's weirdly random. It's a great idea. So that's how the idea for this painting came about. I named this orchid Taquito Noodles. Taquito Noodles wants to know if you have subscribed yet. If not, there's a handy button right there that you can click on that'll help you to keep up to date with all 5 of my new art videos every single week. Taquito Noodles waves bye to you.